Whispers of the Beast King's cruelty echoed across the kingdoms. To secure peace, a desperate lord offered his most wretched daughter as tribute. Veiled in heavy silk, condemned to marry a monster, she harbored a secret that would shatter the royal court and ignite an empire. Rain lashed against the heavy oak carriage, the rhythmic drumming a grim lullaby for the journey north. Inside the damp, freezing cabin sat Liora of House Ravencourt, shivering beneath a velvet cloak that was entirely too thin for the biting winds of the Blood Moon Mountains. Her face, as it had been for the past 10 years, was obscured by a thick ash-gray veil. In the human kingdom of Highcross, the name Liora Ravencourt was synonymous with tragedy and revulsion. A decade ago, a mysterious fire had ravaged the western wing of the Ravencourt estate. While Liora had survived, the realm was told that the flames had melted her features into a grotesque, terrifying ruin. Her stepmother, Lady Isolde, had declared the girl unfit for public eyes, locking her away in the highest tower and forcing her to wear the heavy linen veil whenever she stepped beyond her chamber doors. But the tragedy of her face was a meticulously crafted lie. Beneath the coarse fabric, Liora possessed no scars. She was in fact devastatingly beautiful, a stark contrast to her favored younger half-sister Celeste. Lady Isolde, consumed by a venomous envy and terrified that Liora's blossoming features would eclipse Celeste's chances of a royal marriage, had fabricated the extent of the injuries. The veil was not a shield for the world. It was a prison for Liora. Over the years, Lord Aldrich Ravencourt, a man of weak spine and immense greed, simply chose to ignore his eldest daughter's existence, letting the rumor of the ugly heir become undisputed truth. Now that very lie had sealed her fate. The Ironclaw pack, a brutal and ancient lineage of lycans that ruled the northern territories, had recently crushed the Highcross armies in a bloody border dispute. To cement a fragile peace treaty, King Kael demanded a bride of noble blood from House Ravencourt. He had expected Celeste, the famed Rose of Highcross, but Lord Aldrich could not bear to send his golden child to the bed of a beast. Capitalizing on a vaguely worded clause in the treaty that simply demanded a daughter, Aldrich had dragged Liora from her tower, packed her into a carriage, and sent his discarded, supposedly deformed daughter to be the sacrificial lamb. Outside the carriage, the thundering of hooves signaled the approach of her escort. Commander Silas Stonefang Kael's second-in-command rode a massive destrier alongside the window. Silas was a towering mountain of muscle and scars, his eyes glowing with a faint, unnatural amber light in the gloom. "We approach Iron Peak Stronghold, my lady," Silas called out over the howling wind, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. There was no mockery in his tone, only a rigid military formality. Yet Liora could sense the pity radiating from him. The wolves had excellent senses. They could smell her terror. "Thank you, Commander," Liora replied, her voice soft but steady. She adjusted the heavy veil, ensuring not a single sliver of skin was visible. She had been warned by her father that if she removed the veil and revealed the deception too soon, King Kael might view it as an act of war, slaughtering her and marching on Highcross. She was to remain veiled until the wedding night. As the carriage crested the final ridge, Iron Peak Stronghold loomed into view. It was a fortress of black volcanic stone carved directly into the side of a jagged mountain, completely lacking the delicate marble columns and glass windows of her home. It was raw, brutal, and imposing. Torches lined the massive iron gates, casting dancing shadows over the hundreds of lycan warriors who stood in silent, terrifying formation to receive their new queen. The carriage ground to a halt. The door was wrenched open by a guard, and Liora stepped out into the freezing mud. Standing at the top of the stone steps was King Kael Blackthorn. He was magnificent and terrifying. Taller and broader than any man in Highcross, Kael possessed an aura of absolute suffocating authority. His dark hair was swept back from a face that was strikingly handsome, yet incredibly harsh, marked by a single jagged, pale scar that cut down his jawline. His eyes were the color of forged steel, cold and piercing. He wore a heavy mantle of black wolf fur over dark leather armor, looking less like a groom and more like a warlord preparing for a slaughter. Kael's steel gaze locked onto the huddled, veiled figure at the bottom of the steps. The rumors of Highcross trickery had reached him days ago. He knew Lord Aldrich had not sent the beautiful Celeste. He knew he was looking at the ugly heir, a woman supposedly so repulsive that children wept at her shadow. A muscle ticked in Kael's jaw. His wolf, the primal spirit residing within him, snarled in deep insult. "They send us their refuse. They mock us." He descended the steps slowly, the crowd of lycans parting for him like water. He stopped mere inches from Liora. She kept her head bowed, her hands trembling violently within her velvet muff. "So," Kael's voice was dangerously quiet, yet it carried across the silent courtyard. Lord Aldrich offers me the shadow instead of the sun. He believes a heavy veil can mask the insult of this treaty. Liora forced herself to speak, remembering the manners drilled into her. I am Liora of House Ravencourt, your majesty. I am here to honor the pact. Kael scoffed the sound cold and dismissive. He did not reach out to touch her. He did not offer her welcome. You are here because your father is a coward, he said flatly. But the Ironclaw do not break their oaths, even when humans twist theirs. He turned his back on her, his heavy fur mantle sweeping through the air. Take her to the bridal chambers. The ceremony begins at midnight under the full moon, as is our way. As Kael walked away, Liora exhaled a shaky breath. She was trapped in a fortress of monsters, bound to a king who despised her before he even knew her true face. But as she followed the guards into the dark, cavernous halls of the keep, a quiet, defiant spark ignited in her chest. She had survived Lady Isolda's cruelty. She would survive the Alphaking. The hours before midnight crawled by with agonizing slowness. Liora was sequestered in the bridal chambers, a sprawling room carved from the same black volcanic stone as the rest of the fortress. Despite the roaring fire and the massive hearth, the cold seemed to seep through the very walls. 3 lycan handmaidens entered without knocking. They moved with predatory grace, their eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. The eldest, a woman named Sarah with a heavily scarred face and graying hair, carried a bundle of crimson fabric. The ceremonial gown, Sarah said curtly, laying it across the bed. You will wear this for the blood vow. Liora nodded silently. The handmaidens worked with efficient brutality, stripping away her travel-stained clothes and dressing her in the traditional garments. The gown was a masterpiece of deep crimson velvet, heavily embroidered with silver threads depicting howling wolves and crescent moons. It was far richer than the rags she had been accustomed to in her tower, but it felt heavy like armor. Still, the ash-gray veil remained securely fastened to her crown. As the handmaidens worked, they spoke among themselves in the lycan tongue, a guttural, rolling language Liora did not understand. But she caught the tone. Mockery, disgust, pity. You afraid, girl? Sarah asked suddenly in the common tongue, her scarred face unreadable. Liora met her eyes through the veil. Terrified, she admitted quietly. But fear is useless without action. Sarah paused, something shifting in her expression. A flicker of surprise, perhaps even respect. Maybe you'll last longer than I thought, the handmaiden muttered. When they finished, Liora stood alone before the tall mirror. The crimson gown clung to her frame, elegant and regal. But the veil turned her into a faceless specter. A ghost bride for a beast king. She touched the ceremonial dagger that had been left on the table. It was beautiful, the blade gleaming in the firelight, the hilt wrapped in dark leather. For the blood vow, they had said. A binding ritual where blood would be exchanged. Liora's fingers trembled as she held it. For a moment, she considered what it would mean to use it, to end things on her own terms before the humiliation, before the inevitable execution, when Kael discovered the deception. But she set it down. Not yet, not without a fight. The great hall of Iron Peak's stronghold was a theater of shadows and fire. Massive braziers burned with roaring flames, illuminating the ancient banners of the Ironclaw pack that hung from the vaulted ceilings. Thousands of lycans had gathered to witness the union. Their murmurs filled the hall, a low, predatory hum that set Liora's teeth on edge. They were gossiping about her. She could hear the snide remarks, the cruel laughter about the monster bride hidden beneath the gray linen. Liora stood at the heavy wooden double doors at the far end of the hall. The drums began to beat a slow primal rhythm that vibrated through the stone floor and into her bones. The doors swung open. Liora stepped forward. The hall instantly fell dead silent. Thousands of glowing eyes turned to fixate on her. The sheer weight of their collective gaze was enough to make her want to collapse, but she forced her spine to straighten. She would not cower. At the end of the long stone aisle stood the altar, a slab of rough-hewn obsidian, and waiting there was Kael. He had shed his armor for the ceremony. He wore a tunic of dark spun silk unlaced at the throat, revealing the corded muscles of his chest. His posture was rigid, his expression a mask of stony indifference. As Liora approached, walking the endless aisle alone, Kael's steel eyes remained locked on the gray veil. He was fulfilling a duty, nothing more, a necessary sacrifice to ensure his borders remained secure. She finally reached the altar, stepping up to stand beside him. He towered over her, radiating a heat that was almost stifling. The pack elder, a grizzled lycan with sightless white eyes and a staff of twisted bones, stepped forward. He spoke in the old tongue, a guttural, rolling language that Liora could not understand. The atmosphere in the room shifted, becoming charged with an electric, ancient magic. The blood of the wolf and the blood of the earth must bind, the elder proclaimed, switching to the common tongue. He produced a ceremonial dagger, its blade gleaming menacingly in the firelight. Kael extended his right hand without hesitation. The elder sliced a shallow line across Kael's broad palm. Dark crimson blood welled to the surface. Then the elder turned to Liora. Trembling, she pulled her hand from the folds of her crimson gown and offered it. The blade stung sharply as it dragged across her pale skin. "Join your lifeblood," the elder commanded. Kael turned to her. He reached out and grasped her bleeding hand, pressing his palm firmly against hers. The moment their skin touched and their blood mixed, a violent, invisible shockwave ripped through the great hall. Liora gasped, her eyes flying wide beneath the veil. A sudden, terrifying heat surged up her arm, blooming in her chest like a second heartbeat. It felt as though a tether of pure fire had suddenly snapped taut between them. But Kael's reaction was far more severe. The Alpha King staggered backward a half step, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth. His pupils dilated, consuming the steel gray of his irises until his eyes were entirely black. A low, vibrating growl erupted from deep within his chest, echoing through the silent hall. His lycan spirit, normally disciplined and locked away beneath a fortress of iron, was slammed violently against his mind, howling a single deafening word. "Mate!" The entire hall erupted into chaos. The pack could feel the shift in the magical atmosphere. The mate bond, the rarest, most sacred phenomenon in lycankind, had just snapped into place. It was impossible. A true mate was a perfect equal, a soul perfectly mirrored. How could the majestic Alpha King be mated to a disfigured, weak human? Kael was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, as he stared down at the small, veiled woman whose hand was still locked in his. His mind was at war. His instincts were screaming at him to pull her into his arms, to claim her, to protect her against the entire room. But his logic, his deep-seated paranoia born of years of betrayal, fought back fiercely. She is a trick. House Ravencourt is playing a deadly game. The bond is struck, the elder whispered, his voice trembling with unprecedented awe. But the union must be seen. Alpha, unveil your queen. The murmurs in the hall died instantly. The silence was absolute, suffocating. Every breath was held. Kael looked down at her, his hands still slick with their mingled blood released hers. He reached up toward the heavy ash-gray linen. Liora squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. This is it. The moment he sees I am not the monster they promised. The moment he realizes my father lied. Kael's large, calloused fingers grasped the hem of the veil. With one swift, decisive motion, he pulled it up and off her head, casting the dark fabric onto the stone floor. The reaction was instantaneous. A collective, echoing gasp swept through the thousands of lycans. Some stumbled back. Others dropped to their knees in sheer shock. Kael froze, utterly paralyzed. Beneath the veil, there were no melted features. There were no hideous burns or twisted scars. Instead, Kael found himself staring into the most breathtakingly beautiful face he had ever seen. Liora's skin was flawless, resembling pale, luminous porcelain under the torchlight. Her lips were a soft, natural rose, slightly parted in terror. But it was her eyes that held him captive. Wide, striking pools of brilliant amethyst framed by thick, dark lashes. As the veil fell, a cascade of hair, the color of spun gold, tumbled down her back, catching the firelight and glowing like a halo. She was not a monster. She was an absolute vision. Kael's black eyes slowly receded back to their steel gray, but the storm within them only intensified. The mate bond thrummed violently in his veins, singing with the proximity of her beauty. But alongside the pull of the bond came a dark, overwhelming fury. Lord Aldrich had not sent his refuse. He had sent a masterpiece hidden away in the dark. Why? Why hide a woman of such staggering beauty behind a rumor of deformity? To an Alpha King who had survived countless assassination attempts and political coups, beauty was merely a weapon. And a weapon hidden this carefully was meant for a devastating strike. "What sorcery is this?" a lord from the back of the hall shouted, breaking the silence. "Witchcraft High Cross has sent a changeling." The hall erupted into shouting, the lycans baring their teeth, confused and agitated by the sudden turn of events. Kael did not look at his pack. He took a sudden, menacing step forward, crowding Liora's space. His large, bloodied hands shot out, but not to strike her. He cupped her jaw, his grip firm and unyielding, tilting her face up so she was forced to look directly into his terrifying, storm-filled eyes. "Who are you?" Kael demanded, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating whisper meant only for her. "Who are you truly? And what poison have you brought into my home?" Liora's breath hitched. She looked into the eyes of her mate, realizing with a sinking dread that shedding the veil had not set her free. It had only thrust her into an even deadlier game. "I am exactly who they said I was," she whispered back, her amethyst eyes locking onto his without breaking contact. "I am the daughter they wanted to throw away, but I am no witch, my king, and I am no poison." Kael's thumb brushed against her lower lip, a startlingly gentle gesture that contradicted the fury radiating from him. The mate bond flared between them, hot and undeniable. "We shall see," Kael murmured darkly. He turned to the roaring crowd, his voice booming over the chaos, echoing with the absolute authority of the Alpha King. "Silence." The hall instantly obeyed the vicious snarls dying in their throats. "The Blood Vow is sealed," Kael declared, his voice ringing off the ancient stones. He looked back at Liora, his expression unreadable, a dangerous mix of possessive fascination and profound suspicion. "The mate bond has spoken. The treaty holds. But the Queen's true trial begins tonight." He grasped her wrist, his grip bruising in its intensity, and dragged her from the altar. The crowd parted like water as he pulled her through the hall toward the shadows of the fortress, toward the private chambers where the real interrogation would begin. As they disappeared through the towering doors, the hall remained in stunned silence. The pack elder lowered his head, his sightless eyes seeing more than any of them. The bond had spoken. Fate had chosen. But the storm was only beginning. Silence, thick and oppressive, draped over the Alpha's private chambers. The massive oak doors slammed shut behind them, the metallic click of the iron lock echoing like a gunshot. Kael stood by the hearth, the roaring fire casting sharp, dancing shadows across the harsh planes of his face. He had dragged Liora away from the chaos of the great hall, his grip on her wrist bruising in its intensity, driven by a primal need to separate his new utterly confounding mate from the prying eyes of his pack. Liora stood near the center of the sprawling room, her crimson velvet gown pooling around her. Without the heavy ash-gray veil, she felt terrifyingly exposed. The cold air of the northern fortress kissed her bare cheeks for the first time in a decade. "Speak," Kael commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. He did not look at her, keeping his gaze fixed on the flames. "Explain to me why the human lord Aldrich Ravencourt would shroud his most beautiful daughter in coarse linen and peddle tales of a monster. Beauty and high cross is currency. Why hide the gold?" Liora wrapped her arms around her waist, a defensive posture learned through years of isolation. "Because my stepmother, Lady Isolde, demanded it," she answered, her voice trembling but clear. "After the fire 12 years ago, she fabricated the extent of my injuries. Told the realm the smoke had melted my face beyond recognition. It was never about protection, it was about elimination. I was a threat to her daughter Celeste's prospects. The veil became her instrument of erasure." Kael finally turned, his steel-gray eyes narrowing. His lycan senses were extraordinary. He could hear the steady, rhythmic thrum of her heartbeat. He could smell the distinct, sharp scent of old sorrow and absolute truth radiating from her skin. She was not lying. "Your father allowed this," Kael said slowly, taking a deliberate step toward her. The mate bond flared between them, a magnetic pull that demanded he bridge the distance, but his paranoia kept him anchored. He allowed his flesh and blood to be buried alive in a tower to appease a jealous wife. "My father is a man who values his comfort above all else, Your Majesty," Liora replied, lifting her chin defiantly. "Ignoring my existence was simply easier than confronting Isolde's wrath." A vicious snarl ripped through Kael's chest. The wolf within him clawed at his ribs, violently outraged on behalf of its mate. The instinct to protect her was overwhelming, warring fiercely with the deeply ingrained suspicion that had kept his pack alive through countless betrayals. His mother's death haunted him still. 12 years old, watching her choke on wolfsbane-laced wine at a peace summit, betrayed by the very humans she'd tried to trust. 30 years of surviving assassination attempts since then had carved paranoia into his bones. Beautiful traps were the deadliest. He'd learned that lesson in blood. "And yet they sent you here," Kael murmured, stopping mere inches from her. He reached out his knuckles, brushing lightly against the soft curve of her cheek. Liora gasped at the contact, a jolt of electricity racing down her spine. "They sent an unblemished jewel into a den of wolves, expecting us to rip you apart because we believed you were a deformed insult." "They sent me to die," Liora whispered, a single tear escaping her amethyst eyes. "Isolde knew you would execute me the moment I removed the veil, interpreting it as a treacherous insult to the treaty. She wanted you to end the problems she created." Kael's thumb caught the tear before it could fall, his touch surprisingly tender for a man built for slaughter. "Then Lady Isolde has grossly miscalculated," he stated, his voice dropping to a gravelly, possessive vow. The Iron Claw do not destroy what is ours. And you, Liora of High Cross, belong to the pack now. You belong to me." The fire crackled in the heavy silence that followed. Liora looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of mercy of understanding. What she found instead was something far more complicated. Desire warred with distrust. Possessiveness battled paranoia. The mate bond pulled him toward her with the force of an avalanche. But years of surviving assassination plots and political machinations had taught him that the most beautiful traps were the deadliest. "How do I know," Kael said quietly, his hand still cupping her face, "that this is not an elaborate snare? That High Cross has not sent you here beautiful and perfect to weaken me, to make me vulnerable?" Liora's eyes widened. She understood then the true depth of his isolation. He was a king surrounded by warriors, yet utterly alone. Trust was a luxury he could not afford. "You don't," she admitted softly. "You have no reason to trust me. I am the daughter of a man who sent me to die. I am the unwanted, the discarded. But I swear to you on whatever remains of my tattered honor that I am no spy. I am no weapon. I am simply a girl who has survived 10 years in darkness and wants nothing more than to see the sun." Something in her words struck him. Perhaps it was the raw honesty. Perhaps it was the way her voice cracked on the word darkness. Or perhaps it was simply the mate bond wearing down his defenses one heartbeat at a time. Kael released her face and stepped back, running a hand through his dark hair. He looked like a man at war with himself. "You will stay in these chambers tonight," he said finally, his tone brooking no argument. "Tomorrow we will address the pack. They must accept you as their Luna, or this fragile peace will shatter before it even begins." He moved toward the door, but paused with his hand on the latch. "For what it's worth," he said without turning around, "I am sorry for what they did to you. No one deserves to be locked away in darkness." And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Liora stood alone in the vast chamber, her hand touching the place on her cheek where his thumb had wiped away her tear. The mate bond hummed in her chest, a golden thread connecting her to the Alphaking who had just walked away. She did not know if he would ever trust her. But for the first time in 10 years, she felt something other than despair. She felt hope. Deep within the Iron Peak stronghold in the guest quarters reserved for the human emissaries who had accompanied the bride, Baron Thaddeus Sinclair, was sharpening a slender, silver-coated stiletto. Sinclair was a well-known aristocrat in the southern courts, ostensibly sent by Lord Aldrich to ensure the safe delivery of the bride. In reality, he was Lady Isolde's private executioner, a man whose loyalty could be purchased for the right price and whose conscience had long since been buried beneath layers of greed and ambition. Isolde had not left Liora's demise to chance. If the Alpha King did not execute the girl in a fit of rage over the veil, Sinclair was ordered to finish the job. Furthermore, he was to assassinate Alpha King Kael himself using a poison derived from wolfsbane and refined nightshade. The goal was to frame the Lycan pack for a treacherous double murder, igniting a holy war that would allow High Cross to call upon the vast armies of the neighboring human empires to eradicate the wolves once and for all. The twisted drama of Liora's unveiling had thrown a complication into Sinclair's plans, but the mission remained unchanged. Tonight, during the celebratory feast, the Baron would strike. The human lords would have their war, and the ugly heir would finally be erased from history. Sinclair held the blade up to the candlelight, admiring the way it gleamed. He had coated it with a concentrated solution of wolfsbane oil, enough to paralyze a lycan's heart with a single scratch. "Tomorrow," he murmured to himself, a cold smile playing on his lips, "the Beast King falls, and the veiled whore follows." He slid the stiletto into a concealed sheath at his waist and adjusted his velvet doublet. The feast would begin within the hour. Everything was in place. The celebratory feast was a tense, brooding affair. The great hall had been transformed with long, heavy oak tables, groaning under the weight of roasted meats, dark ales, and winter root vegetables. The lycans ate with predatory grace, their glowing eyes darting continuously toward the high table where their Alpha King sat beside his shocking, breathtakingly beautiful human mate. Liora sat rigidly beside Kael, acutely aware of every stare, every whisper. She wore the delicate silver diadem that marked her as the newly crowned Queen of the Ironclaw, but she felt entirely like an imposter. Despite the undeniable electric connection thrumming between her and Kael, the sheer danger of her new reality was suffocating. Kael had barely spoken to her since they had taken their seats. He ate mechanically, his jaw tight, his posture radiating controlled violence. She could feel the tension rolling off him in waves. The mate bond made her hyper-aware of his every shift in mood, every flicker of emotion that crossed his carefully guarded face. Below them, seated with the few human guards allowed inside the keep, was Baron Thaddeus Sinclair. Leora's eyes locked onto the Baron, and a cold tendril of recognition slithered down her spine. She knew that face. She had seen it before years ago during one of her rare moments of freedom when she had been allowed to attend a family dinner before Isolde's paranoia had locked her away permanently. Sinclair had been there a frequent and whispering guest in Isolde's private parlors. She remembered the way he had looked at her stepmother, the way they had huddled together in dark corners, their voices low and conspiratorial. A sudden icy dread washed over her. He is here for a reason. Isolde sent him. As the feast progressed, the traditional passing of the ceremonial chalice began. It was a massive goblet of wrought iron and ruby filled with spiced northern wine. It was to be passed from the most honored guest to the king, a symbol of shared trust and goodwill. Baron Sinclair stood his velvet doublet, cutting a sharp contrast against the rough furs of the lycans. He held the chalice high, a sickeningly smooth smile plastered across his aristocratic face. To the Alphaking, Sinclair called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous hall, and to his surprising new queen. May this union bring the peace house Ravencourt so deeply desires. He stepped forward, ascending the stone steps to the high table, and offered the chalice to Kael. Lyra's sharp eyes caught something that made her blood run cold. There on the rim of the goblet, right where Kael's lips would touch, was a minute, almost imperceptible smudge of dark purple powder. In a flash of terrifying clarity, she recognized the scent drifting from the wine. It was faint, masked by cloves and cinnamon, but unmistakable to someone who had spent years learning about herbs and poisons from the old groundskeeper who had been her only companion in the tower. Wolfsbane. Concentrated and lethal. The powder would dissolve the moment liquid touched it, releasing the poison directly into Kael's system. Within seconds, his heart would seize. He would collapse, choking, dying in front of his entire pack. And Isolde would have her war. Kael reached out to take the chalice, his expression one of bored indifference. Custom dictated that he drink, that he honor the offering from the human guest. Leora's mind raced. There was no time to explain, no time to warn him without causing a scene that could spiral into violence. If she accused the Baron without proof, it could be seen as an insult, a provocation. The fragile peace would shatter. But if she did nothing, Kael would die. The mate bond flared in her chest, a burning, desperate need to protect him, overwhelming every rational thought. No. The word ripped from Leora's throat before she could stop herself. Driven by a sudden, desperate terror, she lunged sideways, her hands shooting out to slap the heavy iron chalice from Sinclair's grasp. The goblet hit the stone floor with a deafening crash. The dark red wine spilled across the dais, and immediately the liquid began to hiss and bubble violently. Where the wine touched the ancient, spell-woven stones of the keep, it reacted, releasing a noxious vapor that smelled of burning metal and death. The hall erupted. Baron Sinclair, realizing his assassination attempt was foiled, drew his concealed silver stiletto with lightning speed. His face twisted into a mask of rage and desperation. He lunged directly at Liora, the blade aimed at her heart, intending to silence Isolde's problem forever. He never even made it a single step. With a roar that shook the very foundations of Iron Peak's stronghold, Kael moved. He was a blur of lethal, unbridled violence, faster than any human eye could follow. He intercepted Sinclair mid-lunge, his massive hand closing around the Baron's throat and hoisting the grown man entirely off the floor as if he weighed nothing. The silver stiletto clattered uselessly against the stones. Kael's eyes were no longer gray. They were entirely black, the pupils consumed by the beast that raged within him. His fangs had descended long and lethal, and a guttural demonic growl erupted from his chest. "You dare!" Kael snarled, his voice no longer entirely human, overlapping with the deep, rumbling growl of his wolf. "Bring poison into my home. You dare bear steel against my mate." Sinclair choked, his face turning a vibrant shade of purple as his legs kicked desperately in the air. Blood trickled from his lips as Kael's grip tightened, crushing his windpipe. "Highcross will burn," Sinclair managed to wheeze out, defiant even in the face of death. "The armies will come. You cannot stop what had already begun." Kael's eyes narrowed, and his lips pulled back in a feral snarl. "Let them come," he growled. There was a sickening crack, the sound of bone and cartilage giving way. Sinclair's body went limp, his eyes staring sightlessly at the vaulted ceiling. Kael tossed the lifeless corpse down the stone steps like discarded refuse. The body tumbled and landed in a broken heap at the base of the dais. The entire hall was frozen in shocked silence. 2,400 lycans stood motionless, their eyes fixed on their Alpha King, who stood on the dais, chest heaving, covered in the blood of the would-be assassin. Slowly, Kael turned back to Liora. His chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, the beast still roaring just beneath his skin, demanding more blood, more violence, more retribution for the threat against his mate. But as his black eyes locked onto her terrified, trembling form, the monster receded, pulled back by the golden thread of the mate bond. She had saved his life. The human woman battered by her own kind and thrown to the wolves had risked everything to protect him. In that moment, the last wall of Kael's suspicion crumbled into dust. The mate bond snapped fully into place, an unbreakable, blinding chain of loyalty and absolute devotion. Kael crossed the distance between them in 2 strides. He dropped to his knees before her, ignoring the thousands of his kin watching in stunned, unprecedented silence. He took her shaking hands in his massive, bloodied ones and pressed his forehead against her palms in the ultimate gesture of lycan submission and reverence. "You are my queen." Kael swore, his voice raw with emotion, a solemn vow witnessed by the ancient stones and the assembled pack. "My life is yours. My pack is yours. My soul is yours." He lifted his head, his steel-gray eyes burning with a terrifying, righteous fury. "And tomorrow, Kate," he declared, his voice ringing through the silent hall, "we march on High Cross, not to honor a broken treaty, but to burn Lady Isolde's tower to the ground and exact vengeance for the stolen years of my mate." Liora looked down at the fierce, brutal king kneeling at her feet. Tears streamed down her face, but they were no longer tears of fear. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something she had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten its name. Belonging. "I don't want vengeance," she whispered, her voice breaking. She cupped his scarred jaw gently, her thumb brushing against the jagged line that marked him. "I want justice, and I want my sister freed from that woman's poison." Kael's eyes softened, just a fraction, but it was enough. "Then justice you shall have, my Luna," he murmured, turning his head to press a kiss against her palm. Every single drop. He stood pulling her up with him and turned to face his pack, his arm wrapped around her waist, anchoring her to his side, a clear declaration of his claim and his protection. "Hear me, Ironclaw," Kael's voice boomed, echoing off the stone walls. "This woman, Liora Ravencourt, is your Luna. She has proven her loyalty with action, not words. She has saved my life, and in doing so has saved this pack from war born of treachery. Any who question her place at my side will answer to me." The silence stretched for a heartbeat, then another, and then Commander Silas Stonefang stepped forward. The massive beta dropped to one knee, his fist over his heart. "My queen," Silas said, his gravelly voice filled with respect. "I doubted you. I was wrong. You have my loyalty now and always." One by one, the lycans in the hall followed. They knelt, 2,400 warriors bowing to the human woman who had proven herself worthy. Leora's breath caught in her throat. She had gone from prisoner to queen in the span of a single night. Kael's arm tightened around her waist, and she leaned into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Rise," Kael commanded, and his pack obeyed as one. He looked down at Liora, his eyes searching hers. "Can you ride?" he asked quietly. She blinked, confused. I learned as a child before the tower. But it has been years." "Then you will relearn," Kael said, a grim smile touching his lips. "We leave at dawn, 300 warriors, 3 days' march to High Cross. And when we arrive, Lady Isolde will answer for her crimes." Liora nodded, her heart pounding. She was about to return to the place that had been her prison, but this time she would not be alone. This time she would have an army at her back and a mate at her side. "I'm ready," she whispered. Kael bent his head, his lips brushing against her temple. "I know you are," he murmured. "You are stronger than you know, Liora, and I will spend the rest of my life ensuring you never forget it." The night was long, but for the first time in a decade, Liora did not fear the darkness, because she was no longer alone. The pre-dawn hours found Liora in the armory, a cavernous chamber deep within the fortress filled with weapons and armor that had been forged over centuries. Kael had insisted she learn the basics of self-defense, and he had summoned Commander Silas to provide the training. Silas handed her a lycan dagger shorter and lighter than a sword designed for close combat. The blade was made of a dark, almost black metal, etched with runes that glowed faintly in the torchlight. "This is moon silver," Silas explained, his tone gruff but patient. "Forged in the heart of the mountain. It will cut through armor and bone alike. Keep it close. Always." Liora wrapped her fingers around the leather-bound hilt. It felt foreign and heavy in her hand, but also strangely reassuring. "Thank you, Commander," she said softly. Silas studied her for a moment, his amber eyes thoughtful. "You saved the Alpha's life," he said bluntly. "That makes you pack in blood indeed. But more than that, you did not hesitate. You acted. That is the mark of a true Luna." Liora felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. Respect from a warrior like Silas was not given lightly. "I will do my best to be worthy of it," she replied. Silas nodded, a rare smile crossing his scarred face. "You already are." As the first light of dawn broke over the Blood Moon Mountains, the war party assembled in the courtyard of Iron Peak Stronghold. 300 lycan warriors armed and armored stood in perfect formation. Their breath misted in the freezing air, their eyes glowing with anticipation. Kael stood at the head of the formation, mounted on a massive black destrier that stamped and snorted, sensing the battle readiness of its rider. He wore his full war regalia, black leather armor, reinforced with steel plates, a heavy cloak of wolf fur, and a longsword strapped to his back. Beside him on a smaller but equally spirited mare sat Liora. She wore a crimson riding cloak over a practical leather tunic and breeches that the handmaidens had provided. Her golden hair was braided back from her face, and the silver diadem of the Luna rested on her brow. The lycan dagger was sheathed at her waist. She looked every inch a warrior queen. Kael glanced at her, and despite the gravity of the mission ahead, a flicker of pride and possessiveness crossed his face. "You look magnificent," he said quietly for her ears alone. Liora felt her cheeks flush, but she met his gaze steadily. "I look terrified," she admitted. "Fear is not weakness," Kael replied. "It is proof that you are alive. And you, my Luna, are very much alive." He raised his hand and the war party fell silent. "We ride for High Cross," Kael declared, his voice carrying over the assembled warriors. "We ride for justice. We ride to reclaim what was stolen and to ensure that those who conspire against the Ironclaw face the consequences of their treachery. We are not invaders. We are the reckoning." A resounding howl erupted from the lycans, a primal bone-chilling sound that echoed off the mountains. Kael spurred his destrier forward, and the war party surged into motion, a tide of fur and steel flowing out of the gates and onto the road that led south. Liora urged her mare to keep pace with Kael, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She was going home, but this time she was bringing an army. The journey south was grueling. They traveled through the Blood Moon Mountains, following narrow passes and treacherous trails that wound through the snow-covered peaks. The temperature hovered around 15 degrees below freezing, and the wind cut like knives. But the lycans were creatures of the north, bred for harsh climates and brutal conditions. They moved with relentless efficiency, covering nearly 30 miles a day. At night, they made camp in sheltered valleys, building massive bonfires that kept the cold at bay. Liora found herself sitting beside the fire, surrounded by lycan warriors who treated her with a deference that still felt surreal. On the first night, Kael taught her the basics of combat, with the dagger, his hands guiding hers, as he showed her the proper grip, the angle of the strike, the way to defend against an attacker. "You will never be helpless again," he murmurs, his breath warm against her ear. "I swear it." On the second night, Sarah and two other female lycans approached Liora, offering her a flask of strong mead and sharing stories of past battles and old legends. It was the first time Liora had experienced anything resembling female friendship, and she found herself laughing, truly laughing, for the first time in years. On the third night, as they camped within sight of the High Cross border, Kael pulled Liora aside, away from the firelight and into the shadows of the trees. "Tomorrow we arrive," he said, his voice low and serious. "I need you to understand what will happen. When we confront Isolde, it will not be a negotiation. It will be a reckoning. There will be violence. There will be blood. If you cannot stomach it, I will leave you here with a guard." Liora shook her head, her amethyst eyes blazing with determination. "I have lived in fear of that woman for 10 years, she said firmly. "I will not hide while you face her. I need to see this through. I need to look her in the eyes and show her that she did not break me." Kael studied her face for a long moment, and then he nodded. "Very well," he said. "But you stay close to me, at all times. Do you understand?" "I understand," Liora replied. Kael reached out, cupping her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing against her cheekbones. "I have led armies," he said quietly, his steel-gray eyes locked on hers. "I have conquered territories and crushed rebellions. But you, Liora, you terrify me." She blinked, surprised. "Why?" "Because I would burn the world for you," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "And that kind of love makes a king vulnerable." Leora's breath caught. She reached up, covering his hands with hers. "Then we will be vulnerable together," she whispered. And then she kissed him. It was not the first time their lips had met. There had been a brief, chaste kiss during the Blood Vow ceremony, but this was different. This was a claiming, a promise, a declaration that they were bound not just by magic, but by choice. The mate bond flared between them, a golden light that seemed to shimmer in the air, invisible even in the darkness. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless Kael rested his forehead against hers. Tomorrow, he murmured, we end this. And then, my Luna, we begin our life together. Truly. Liora smiled, her heart full. Tomorrow, she agreed. And as they stood together in the shadow of the trees, the war party sleeping around the dying fires, the future felt for the first time like something worth fighting for. The morning broke cold and gray over the Montana borderlands. A thick fog clung to the valleys, shrouding the landscape in an eerie, otherworldly stillness. The war party broke camp in silence, each warrior moving with practiced efficiency, checking weapons, tightening armor, preparing for what lay ahead. Liora stood beside her mare, her crimson cloak billowing in the wind. She stared south toward the horizon where Ravencourt Manor lay hidden beyond the rolling hills. Her childhood home, her prison, the place where she had been erased from existence. Today, she would reclaim her name. Kael approached his massive frame, cutting through the pall like a dark specter. He carried something in his hands, a bundle of leather and steel. For you, he said, offering it to her. Liora unwrapped the bundle to find a piece of light armor, a fitted leather vest reinforced with steel plates designed to protect her vital organs without restricting movement. It was clearly custom-made, crafted during the journey by one of the pack's armorers. You made this for me, she asked, surprised. The pack made it, Kael corrected. They want their Luna protected. Liora felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had cried enough in her life. Today was for strength. With Kael's help, she donned the armor over her tunic. It fit perfectly, molding to her form like a second skin. How does it feel? Kael asked. Liora rolled her shoulders, detesting the range of motion. Like I can finally fight back. Kael's eyes darkened with fierce approval. Good, because today you will. He turned to address the assembled warriors, his voice carrying over the sound of the wind. We move fast and we move silent. No unnecessary bloodshed. Our target is Lady Isolde Ravencourt, and any who stand with her. Lord Aldrich will be given a choice: surrender the guilty or share their fate. Commander Silas, take 50 warriors and secure the perimeter. No one enters or leaves the estate without my permission. The rest of you with me. We end this today. A chorus of affirmative growls rippled through the ranks. Kael mounted his destrier, and Liora climbed onto her mare. The war party surged forward, moving like a dark tide across the landscape. Within 2 hours, Ravencourt Manor came into view. It was exactly as Liora remembered it, and yet completely foreign. The sprawling estate sat atop a gentle rise surrounded by manicured gardens that had long since withered in the winter cold. The main house was a massive structure of gray stone and dark timber, with dozens of windows that gleamed like old dead eyes in the morning light. And there, rising from the eastern wing, was the North Tower. Leora's breath caught in her throat as she stared at it. The tower where she had spent 10 years of her life. The narrow windows, the cold stone walls, the suffocating darkness. Kael's hand found hers, squeezing gently. You are not that girl anymore, he said quietly. You are the Luna of the Ironclaw, and you are mine. She cannot touch you now. Liora nodded, drawing strength from his words and from the golden thread of the mate bond that pulsed between them. As they approached the main gates, a contingent of Ravencourt guards emerged, looking pale and terrified at the sight of 300 lycan warriors descending upon the estate. The captain of the guard, a grizzled man named Harlow, stepped forward with his hands raised in a gesture of peace. King Kael, Harlow called out, his voice shaking slightly. Lord Aldrich was not expecting your arrival. He requests a moment to prepare a proper welcome. Kael's expression was carved from stone. This is not a social visit, Captain. Tell Lord Aldrich that he has 1 hour to produce Lady Isolde and deliver her to the courtyard. If he fails to comply, I will drag her out myself, and I will burn this estate to the ground in the process. Harlow blanched. His eyes darted to Liora, recognition flickering across his face. The veiled lady. But she was no longer veiled, and she sat atop a warhorse beside the Beast King, wearing armor and a crown. I will relay your message, Your Majesty. Harlow stammered, and he quickly retreated into the manor. Kael turned to Silas. Secure the perimeter. No one leaves. Silas nodded and signaled to his warriors. They fanned out, surrounding the estate in a ring of steel and fangs. The war party settled in to wait. Liora dismounted, her legs stiff from the long ride. She walked slowly toward the manor gates, staring up at the imposing structure. Kael followed, staying close. Tell me about it, he said quietly. The tower. Liora was silent for a moment, gathering her thoughts. It was cold, she said finally. Always cold. The fire was never enough. I had one window facing north, so I never saw the sun. Meals were brought once a day, usually stale bread and thin soup. The only person who showed me kindness was Mrs. Clara, the groundskeeper's wife. She would smuggle me books, teach me about herbs and medicines. She told me stories about the outside world, about places I would never see. She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. There were days when I wanted to throw myself from that window. Days when the darkness felt like it would consume me entirely. But I held on. I told myself that one day someone would come for me, that one day I would be free. Kael's jaw tightened, fury radiating from him in waves. She will pay for every day you spent in that tower, he vowed. I will make certain of it. Before Liora could respond, the manor doors burst open. Lord Aldrich Ravencourt stumbled out, looking haggard and drunk, despite the early hour. His clothes were rumpled, his face unshaven. He was a shadow of the proud Lord Liora remembered from her childhood. Behind him, flanked by 2 guards, came Lady Isolde. Isolde looked every inch the aristocratic lady despite the circumstances. She wore a gown of deep emerald velvet, her dark hair swept up in an elaborate style, but her eyes, cold and calculating, betrayed the venom that lurked beneath the polished exterior. When her gaze landed on Liora, her expression twisted into something ugly. So, Isolde said, her voice dripping with contempt. The little wretch returns, and dressed as a whore queen, no less. How delightful! Kael moved so fast that even Liora barely saw it. One moment he was beside her, the next he was in front of Isolde, his hand wrapped around her throat, lifting her off the ground. You will address my mate with respect, he snarled, his eyes flashing black, or I will rip out your tongue and feed it to the crows. Isolde clawed at his hand, gasping for air. Aldrich let out a pathetic whimper, but made no move to intervene. Kael, Liora said softly, placing a hand on his arm. Let her down. I want her to face justice, not summary execution. Kael held Isolde for a moment longer, making his point, and then released her. She collapsed to the ground, coughing and gasping. Liora stepped forward, looking down at the woman who had tormented her for so long. Lady Isolde Ravencourt, Liora said, her voice clear and steady, you are accused of false imprisonment, conspiracy to commit murder, and inciting war through treachery. You sent Baron Thaddeus Sinclair to assassinate King Kael. You orchestrated my delivery to the Ironclaw, expecting my execution to provide the justification for a genocidal war. And for 10 years you kept me locked in that tower, spreading lies about my appearance to serve your own ambitions. Isolde climbed to her feet, her face flushed with rage. You little bitch, she spat. You think you can come here with your animal pack and accuse me I did what was necessary to protect this family, to protect Celeste from your contamination. You were always a blight, a stain on the Ravencourt name. Your mother was a whore, and you are no better. Kael growled a low, dangerous sound, but Liora held up a hand, stopping him. My mother, Liora said coldly, was a good woman who died bringing me into this world. You have no right to speak her name. She turned to Aldrich, who was swaying slightly, his eyes unfocused. Father, Liora said, and the word tasted like ash in her mouth. Did you know about the veil, about Isolde's lies? Aldrich looked at her, and for a moment something like shame flickered in his bloodshot eyes. I suspected, he admitted, his voice slurred. But Isolde, she was so convincing. And it was easier, you understand, easier to believe the lie than to confront the truth. Easier to lock you away than to deal with her wrath. Liora felt something break inside her. The last fragile thread of hope that her father might have cared even a little snapped. You are a coward, she said flatly, and you are no father of mine. Aldrich flinched as if she had struck him. Kael stepped forward, his presence overwhelming. Lord Aldrich Ravencourt, he said, his voice ringing with authority. You allowed your daughter to be imprisoned for a decade based on lies. You sent her to the Ironclaw as a sacrificial pawn. You enabled treachery and assassination. For these crimes, you are stripped of your title and lands. The Ravencourt estate is hereby seized and will be redistributed to those who suffered under your negligence. Aldrich's face went white. You cannot. I can, Kael interrupted coldly, and I have. You will be exiled to a monastery in the far north where you will live out your days in penance. Be grateful I'm allowing you to live at all. He turned to Isolde, and his expression turned glacial. As for you, Lady Isolde, your crimes are far graver. You attempted to assassinate an Alphaking. You orchestrated a plot to ignite a war that would have killed thousands. And you tortured your stepdaughter for a decade out of petty jealousy. Isolde lifted her chin defiantly. I regret nothing. That girl was a threat, and I neutralized her. If your barbaric pack had done as they should have and killed her, we would not be having this conversation. Kael's lips pulled back in a feral snarl. You will spend the rest of your miserable life in the North Tower, he declared, the same cell where you imprisoned Liora. You will wear the same veil you forced upon her. Every day, you will look out the window and see the world you can no longer touch. And when you die forgotten and alone, your name will be remembered only as a cautionary tale about the price of cruelty. Isolde's composure finally cracked. Her eyes widened with genuine fear. No, she breathed. No, you cannot. I am a lady of the realm. I have rights. You have nothing, Kael said flatly. Commander Silas, take her to the tower. Lock her in, post a guard. She is to receive the same treatment she gave Liora. 1 meal a day, no visitors, no comforts. Silas stepped forward, his massive hand closing around Isolde's arm. She screamed, thrashing and clawing, but she might as well have been struggling against a mountain. You will regret this. Isolde shrieked as Silas dragged her toward the manor. All of you, the veiled whore, will be your downfall. You will see. You will all see. Her voice faded as she was hauled inside, and an eerie silence fell over the courtyard. Liora stood motionless, staring at the space where Isolde had been. She felt numb, as if her body and mind were struggling to process what had just happened. It was over. After 10 years, it was finally over. Kael's arms wrapped around her from behind, pulling her back against his solid chest. Breathe, Luna, he murmured. Just breathe. Liora realized she had been holding her breath. She exhaled shakily and then inhaled, filling her lungs with cold, clean air. She can't hurt me anymore, she whispered almost to herself. No, Kael agreed. She cannot. Liora turned in his arms, looking up at him. I need to see it, she said. The tower, one last time. Kael studied her face and then nodded. Then we go together. The North Tower was exactly as Liora remembered it. The narrow spiral staircase, the cold stone walls, the oppressive darkness. Each step she took felt like walking through a nightmare made real. Kael stayed close, his hand on the small of her back, a constant reassuring presence. When they reached the top, Liora pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the room that had been her prison. It was small, perhaps 12 feet by 12 feet. The single window faced north, letting in only dim gray light. There was a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a rickety chair, and a small table. The fireplace was empty and cold. Liora walked slowly around the room, her fingers trailing over the rough stone walls. She stopped at the window, looking out at the landscape she had stared at for so many years. I used to imagine what it would be like, she said softly, to be free, to walk outside without a veil, to feel the sun on my face. But I never imagined this. I never imagined I would have an army, a mate, a pack. I never imagined I would be a queen. Kael came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head. You are all of those things, he said quietly, and so much more. You are brave and strong and resilient. You survived what would have broken most people. And now you will help me build a kingdom where no one else has to suffer the way you did. Liora leaned back into him, drawing strength from his warmth. What will we do with this place, she asked. Kael was silent for a moment, considering. We will turn it into a sanctuary, he said finally. A refuge for those who have been abused, abandoned, or cast out. We will fill these halls with light and laughter, and we will ensure that the darkness you endured is transformed into hope for others. Liora felt tears stream down her face, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of release, of healing, of gratitude. That is perfect, she whispered. She turned to face him and pulled something from the pocket of her cloak. It was the ash-gray veil, the symbol of her imprisonment. I want to burn it, she said. Here, now. Kael nodded. He walked to the fireplace and quickly built a small fire using wood from a stack in the corner. When the flames were crackling, he stepped back. Liora approached the fire holding the veil in both hands. For a moment, she simply stared at it, this piece of coarse linen that had defined her existence for so long. And then, with a decisive motion, she threw it into the flames. The veil caught fire immediately, the fabric curling and blackening, releasing acrid smoke that spiraled up the chimney. Within moments, it was nothing but ash. Liora watched it burn, and with each lick of flame, she felt lighter, freer. When the last ember died, she turned to Kael. I'm ready to leave, she said. I'm ready to start our life together. Kael smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his harsh features. Then let us go home, my Luna. They descended the tower together, leaving the darkness behind. The war party remained at Ravencourt Manor for 3 more days, overseeing the transition of power and ensuring that the estate would be properly managed until a new steward could be appointed. During that time, Liora made several important discoveries. The first was Mrs. Clara, the groundskeeper's wife, who had been her only companion during her imprisonment. The old woman wept when she saw Liora throwing her arms around the young queen and thanking the gods for her deliverance. "I knew you were special, child," Mrs. Clara said, her weathered face wreathed in smiles. "I knew you would survive. And look at you now, a queen, a true queen." Liora embraced her tightly. "You kept me alive, Mrs. Clara. You gave me hope when I had none. I will never forget that." She arranged for Mrs. Clara to be given a comfortable cottage on the estate and a generous pension, ensuring that the old woman would never want for anything. The second discovery was a locked chest in Isolde's private chambers. When the chest was broken open, it revealed a trove of damning evidence letters between Isolde and Baron Sinclair, detailing the assassination plot, financial records showing embezzlement of over 40,000 gold sovereigns from the estate coffers, and most damning of all, a journal in Isolde's own hand. In the journal, Isolde had documented everything: her jealousy of Liora's beauty, her plans to fabricate the fire injuries, her scheme to use Liora's death as a pretext for war. She had written it all down as if she never expected to be held accountable. Kael read the journal with a growing sense of rage. "She was meticulous in her cruelty," he said, his voice tight. "Every detail planned, every lie carefully constructed." Liora looked at the journal and felt a strange sense of vindication. There was no longer any doubt, no way for Isolde to deny her crimes. The evidence was irrefutable. "At least history will know the truth," she said quietly. The third discovery was the most unexpected. On the afternoon of the third day, a young woman approached the manor gates asking to speak with Liora. The guards were initially suspicious, but when they realized who she was, they quickly escorted her to the main hall. It was Celeste. Liora's half-sister looked pale and frightened, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple braid. She was dressed in traveling clothes and she carried a small pack on her back. When she saw Liora, she stopped, her eyes wide. "Liora," Celeste breathed. "Is it really you?" Liora felt her heart clench. She had not seen her sister in 10 years, not since the day Isolde had locked her away. Celeste had been 9 years old, then a child who had been taught to fear and avoid her older sister. "It's me," Liora said softly. Celeste took a hesitant step forward and then another, and then she was running, throwing herself into Liora's arms and sobbing. "I'm so sorry," Celeste choked out between tears. "I'm so sorry, Liora. I was a coward. I knew Mother was lying. I knew you weren't a monster. But I was too afraid to speak up. I thought she would lock me away too." Liora held her sister tightly, her own tears falling. "You were a child, Celeste," she whispered. "You have nothing to apologize for. I never blamed you." Celeste pulled back, her face streaked with tears. "When I heard what happened, that you had married the Beast King and that you were coming back with an army, I knew I had to see you. I had to tell you that I'm sorry and that I'm so glad you're alive." Liora cupped her sister's face, wiping away the tears. "I'm alive," she said gently, "and I'm free, and so are you, Celeste. You don't have to be afraid of Isolde anymore." Celeste nodded, sniffling. "What will happen to me?" she asked in a small voice. "With father exiled and mother imprisoned, I have nowhere to go." Liora glanced at Kael, who had been watching the reunion with an unreadable expression. He nodded slightly, giving his approval. "You will come with us," Liora said firmly, "to Iron Peak. You are my sister Celeste, and you will always have a place by my side." Celeste's eyes widened. "Truly, Wako?" "Truly," Liora confirmed. "And perhaps in time you can help me run the sanctuary we are going to create here. A place for those who need refuge and hope." Celeste nodded eagerly, a genuine smile breaking through her tears. "I would like that very much," she said. And so when the war party prepared to depart Ravencourt Manor, Celeste rode with them, her horse positioned near Liora's. As they passed through the gates, Liora looked back one last time at the estate that had been her prison. The north tower rose against the gray sky, and she could just make out the figure of Isolde in the window, pressing her veiled face against the glass. Liora felt no pity, no triumph, only a quiet sense of closure. She turned her face forward toward the mountains, toward Iron Peak, toward home. The journey back to Iron Peak stronghold took 4 days. The war party traveled at a more leisurely pace, and the atmosphere was celebratory. The warriors sang old battle songs, sharing flasks of mead and telling stories around the campfires at night. Celeste integrated into the group with surprising ease. She was quiet and shy at first, but Sarah and the other female lycans took her under their wing, teaching her about pack culture and making her laugh with their bawdy jokes. On the final night before they reached Iron Peak, Kael pulled Liora away from the camp, leading her to a secluded clearing where the stars blazed overhead in a canopy of silver light. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his cloak. He produced a small wooden box intricately carved with wolves and crescent moons. Liora opened it to find a ring. It was simple but beautiful, the band of dark metal set with a single amethyst stone that matched her eyes perfectly. "It is a mating ring," Kael explained. "In lycan culture, when the mate bond is acknowledged and accepted, we exchange rings as a symbol of our eternal commitment. I had it made for you during the journey." Leora's breath caught. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Kael took the ring from the box and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "You are my mate," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "My Luna, my queen. And I vow to spend every day of my life ensuring that you never know darkness again." Liora rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring every ounce of love and gratitude she felt into the gesture. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, she rested her forehead against his. "I love you," she whispered. "I didn't think I was capable of it anymore after so many years alone. But you taught me how to feel again, how to hope, how to live." Kael's arms tightened around her. "I love you, Liora Blackthorn," he said, using her new name for the first time. "And I will spend eternity proving it to you." They stood together under the stars, the mate bond glowing golden between them, and for the first time in her life, Liora felt completely, utterly whole. 6 months had passed since the reckoning at Ravencourt Manor. Iron Peak stronghold had transformed in that time. The fortress, once a symbol of brutal military might, had become something more. It was still a place of strength and power, but now it was also a place of hope and healing. The sanctuary that Liora had envisioned was no longer just a dream. Ravencourt Manor had been converted into a refuge for the abused and abandoned, overseen by Celeste and Mrs. Clara. In the first 3 months alone, they had taken in 127 people, men, women, and children, who had nowhere else to turn. The estate, once a place of darkness and cruelty, now echoed with laughter and the sounds of rebuilding lives. At Iron Peak, Liora had established a council, a governing body composed of both lycans and humans, to advise on matters of law and policy. It was a radical concept, one that had been met with resistance from some of the more traditional pack members. But Kael had supported her fully, and slowly, the council had proven its worth. Trade agreements had been negotiated with neighboring human settlements. Marriages between lycans and humans, once unthinkable, were becoming more common. The cultural divide that had existed for centuries was beginning to close. And Liora, the girl who had once been locked away in darkness, had become the heart of it all. On a crisp autumn morning, Liora stood on the battlements of Iron Peak, looking out over the Blood Moon Mountains. The leaves had turned gold and crimson, painting the landscape in brilliant colors. The air was cool and clean, and finally the sun warmed her face. She wore a gown of deep blue velvet embroidered with silver wolves. The silver diadem of the Luna rested on her golden hair, and most noticeably her belly was round and full heavy with the child she carried. 6 months pregnant. Kael approached from behind, wrapping his arms around her and resting his hands on her swollen belly. "How is our daughter today?" he asked, his voice warm with affection. Liora smiled, covering his hands with hers. "Strong," she said. "She kicked me 3 times during breakfast. I think she is impatient to meet the world." Kael chuckled, a deep rumbling sound. "She takes after her mother then," he said, "stubborn and fierce." Liora leaned back against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Have you thought about names?" she asked. Kael was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I was thinking we could name her Helena, after your mother, and Clara, after the woman who kept you alive in the tower." Liora felt tears prick her eyes. She turned in his arms, looking up at him. "Helena Clara Blackthorn," she said softly. "It's perfect." Kael smiled, one of those rare, genuine smiles that transformed his entire face. "She will be the first true child of both worlds," he said, "a bridge between human and lycan, a symbol of what we can become when we choose unity over division." Liora nodded, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "She will never know what it is to be locked away," she vowed. "She will grow up surrounded by love, by pack, by family. She will be free in a way I never was." Kael bent his head, pressing a tender kiss to her forehead. "She will be extraordinary," he murmured, "because she is yours." Tuna, they stood together on the battlements, looking out over the kingdom they were building. Below them, Iron Peak bustled with activity. Lycan warriors trained in the courtyard. Human merchants set up stalls in the newly established market square. Children, both human and lycan, played together in the streets. It was a vision of the future, a world where the old hatreds and divisions were slowly being replaced by understanding and cooperation. Commander Silas approached, his heavy footsteps echoing on the stone. My king, my queen, he said, bowing respectfully. The council is ready to convene. Kael nodded. We will be there shortly. Silas hesitated, and then he said, If I may, your majesty, I wanted to say that what you have built here, it is remarkable. When I first saw the human bride arrive veiled and trembling, I thought she would last perhaps a week. I was wrong. She is the strongest Luna we have ever had. Liora felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words. Thank you, Commander, she said sincerely. That means more than you know. Silas nodded, and then he turned and strode away. Kael took Liora's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. Ready to face the council, he asked. Liora looked down at the ring on her finger, the amethyst stone glinting in the sunlight. She thought about the girl she had been locked away in darkness, believing she would never be free. And she thought about the woman she had become, a queen, a Luna, a mate, and soon a mother. I'm ready, she said. Together they descended from the battlements and made their way to the council chamber. As the sun set over Iron Peak's stronghold, casting the fortress in hues of gold and crimson, Liora stood once more on the battlements with Kael at her side. The Blood Moon Mountains stretched out before them, vast and eternal. In the distance, she could see the lights of Ravencourt Manor, now a beacon of hope rather than a symbol of her imprisonment. She thought of Isolde, locked away in the North Tower, wearing the veil that had once been forced upon Liora. She thought of her father, exiled to a distant monastery, living out his days in shame and regret. And she thought of Celeste, thriving in her new role as keeper of the sanctuary, finally free from the toxic influence of their mother. Justice had been served. Not with fire and blood, though there had been some of that, but with transformation. The places and people that had caused so much pain were now instruments of healing and hope. What are you thinking about? Kael asked, his arm wrapped around her shoulders. I was thinking, Liora said slowly, about how the worst moments of my life led me here. To you. To this life. And I was thinking that if I had the chance to go back and change it, I wouldn't. Because every moment of darkness, every day in that tower, every tear I cried, it all led me to this moment. And this moment is worth it. All of it. Kael pulled her closer, his hand resting protectively on her belly. You are the bravest person I have ever known, he said, and I am honored to stand beside you. Liora looked up at the stars which were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Tell me a story, she said softly. Tell me about the future, about Helena, about the world she will grow up in. Kael smiled, his steel-gray eyes softening with love. Helena will grow up in a world where the walls between humans and lycans have crumbled, he began. She will be educated by the finest teachers from both cultures. She will learn to fight like a warrior and to lead with compassion. She will be beloved by the pack, and she will carry within her the strength of both her parents. He paused, his thumb tracing gentle circles on Liora's belly. She will never know what it is to be afraid, or to be locked away, or to be told that she is less than she is. She will be free to choose her own path to love, whom she wishes to become, whoever she wants to be. And when she is grown, she will take her place as the rightful heir to the Ironclaw, the first true child of two worlds. Liora felt tears stream down her face, but they were tears of joy. That is a beautiful future, she whispered. It is our future, Kael replied, and we will build it together. As the last light faded from the sky, Liora and Kael stood together on the battlements, the mate bond glowing golden between them, their unborn daughter, a promise of hope, nestled safely in Liora's womb. The veiled bride had become a queen, the wretched tribute had become a legend, and the darkness that had once threatened to consume her had been transformed into an empire of light. Thus the tale of Liora Blackthorn Luna of the Ironclaw became a story told for generations. A story of survival, of love, of transformation. A story that proved that even in the deepest darkness, even when all hope seems lost, the human spirit, the will to survive and thrive, can overcome anything. The Alphaking did not just lift her veil, he elevated her beyond the cruelty of her past. Together they forged an empire where beauty and brutality, human and wolf, reigned as one. An unbreakable, legendary union of soul and shadow. And in the years to come, when Helena Clara Blackthorn was born under a full moon, her first cry echoing through the halls of Iron Peak, the pack celebrated not just the birth of an heir, but the beginning of a new era. An era of unity, of hope, of light. The veiled Luna had rewritten destiny, and the world would never be the same.